Meanwhile, there are some new details about that explosive dossier claiming a connection between President Trump and the Kremlin. A new report reveals Hillary Clinton's campaign and the Democrat National Committee funded at least part of the research that went into the unsubstantiated documents. Republicans in Congress seizing on the new development, saying it should also be part of the Russia investigations.
If it's good to investigate Russians' involvement in the election process in the United States and in regard to Trump, it's purely just as legitimate to investigate Russia versus the Clintons.
Joining us now, Jeff Mason, White House correspondent for Reuters and former president of the White House Correspondents Association. So just, from your role as a journalist, Jeff, this revelation that broke in the Washington Post on Tuesday, that the Democratic National Committee and the Hillary Clinton campaign apparently paid for some of this research that led to this Russian dossier that was published in BuzzFeed back in January. That's really turned this Russian collusion story on its head, hasn't it?
Well, I'm not sure if it turns the whole Russia collusion story on its head. There are lots of different aspects to that. There are lots of different aspects to the probe that the FBI, the FBI Special Prosecutor Mueller is doing, as well as other congressional committees are doing. But it absolutely gives Republicans a reason and a way to turn the finger away from President Trump and on to Hillary Clinton, and that is certainly useful for them. Well, but Hillary Clinton's campaign was affiliated with this effort and denying it the entire time. Well, and I think it's also important to note that apparently the research was started to be paid for by a Republican, and they haven't revealed yet who that is. But yeah, I mean, the Democrats are saying that, and the Republican or the Democratic campaign former spokesman Brian Fallon was saying, look, I didn't know that this was happening, but if I did, I would have offered to go and help. They see this as regular opposition research, and Republicans, including the one that you played a clip from earlier, see this as a reason to investigate the Clintons as well. The Wall Street Journal has an editorial entitled Democrats, Russians, and the FBI, and in that piece, the editorial board writes, it turns out that Russia has sown distrust in the U.S. political system, aided and abetted by the Democratic Party and perhaps the FBI. This is an about-face from the dominant media narrative of the last year, and it requires a full investigation. The American public deserves a full accounting of the scope and nature of Russian meddling in American democracy, and that means following the trail of the Steele dossier as much as it does the meetings of Trump campaign officials. Do we know, did the surveillance of Trump Tower that the president has complained about, was that brought about in part by this Trump dossier, the Steele dossier? I don't know the answer to that, but I know that some people are raising that question and using that then as a reason to point again at what may have been funded or started by Democrats on this entire probe. Look, this has become a very political, very political issue. You've got Democrats believing largely that the election may have been stolen, in part because of Russian meddling. You've got Republicans now saying, well, this all may have started, or at least been partially started, because of something that was funded by Democrats. It's become very political, but the overarching issue that people shouldn't forget is that U.S. intelligence agencies have concluded that Russia meddled in the 2016 election. So there are different aspects of that. This is a different piece that has currently been brought in, but that conclusion is one that was drawn by U.S. Intelligence agencies, and that's the reason those probes are happening. Well, the Wall Street Journal editorial went on to suggest that Robert Mueller's investigation should really include the FBI, which is the agency that he, until recently, ran. And it urges him to go ahead and resign. Is there any talk of that in Washington or on Capitol Hill? Oh, I don't, this is fairly recent. I don't know that there's any talk of him resigning. Robert Mueller is somebody who's been respected by both sides of the political aisle, Republicans and Democrats. Obviously, there are many Republicans, including people here in the White House, who aren't happy about that probe and would like for that whole thing to stop, which, might be sparked if Mueller were to decide to resign. But I don't foresee that happening anytime soon. That report just broke on Tuesday, as I mentioned in the Washington Post. That might not, that news may not include the polling period
for this next item, but President Trump's approval ratings are hitting a new low as a Fox News poll shows 38% of Americans approve of his performance in office. That's a drop of 4 percentage points since September. Fair to say the president has been the subject of a barrage of negative news stories, Jeff.
You know what? I mean, every president faces negative news. I think the president also generates a lot of his own news via Twitter. And in that same poll that you're citing right now, it showed that a lot of people are unhappy with his use of Twitter.
Yeah.
But again, that's something that is a core to who President Trump is. He sees that as a way to communicate directly with Americans, directly with his base. And I think poll numbers showing that he is perhaps less popular or that people don't like his Twitter usage is not going to affect the way he decides to continue to communicate.
Just as we've been talking, he put out a 5-word tweet. The president wrote, "Big news, the budget just passed." Budget just passed. I didn't want to add a word there. He's obviously pretty happy about that in the House of Representatives. Jeff Mason from Reuters. Jeff, thanks very much.